Hi, and welcome to this episode of the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Asking the big questions together. What does the text say? I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. Romans 9:18, a.k.a. Deep and Wide. Thank you for joining for this episode. Today we have a chance to proceed with the second part of our series on the philosophical thought of Victor Cousin. He was a French philosopher, continental thinker in the 19th century, a contemporary of Hegel, a follower in the line of Kant and Hegel and others. And he had some interesting thoughts. So let's get started.
A reading of the Wikipedia article, Victor Cousin. Text is available under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license. Our thanks to the contributors and authors at Wikipedia for the use of this article. Cousin's philosophy. There are three distinctive points in Cousin's philosophy. These are his method, the results of his method, and the application of the method and its results to history, especially to the history of philosophy. It is usual to speak of his philosophy as eclecticism, though it is eclectic only in a secondary and subordinate sense. All eclecticism that is not self-condemned and inoperative implies a system of doctrine as its basis, in fact, a criterion of truth. Otherwise, as Cousin himself remarks, it is simply a blind and useless syncretism, and Cousin saw and proclaimed from an early period in his philosophical teaching the necessity of a system on which to base his eclecticism. The necessity of system was confirmed by the facts of history, which corresponded to his analysis of human consciousness, and so the 3 points of method, results, and the philosophy of history are intimately connected as developments, in a natural order of sequence. They become in practice psychology, ontology and eclecticism in history.
Cousin emphasized the importance of method in philosophy. He uses the non-controversial starting points of observation, analysis and induction. This observational method Cousin regards as that of the 18th century, the method which Descartes began and abandoned, and which Locke and Condillac applied, though imperfectly, and which Thomas Reid and Kant used with more success. He insists that this is the true method of philosophy as applied to consciousness, in which alone the facts of experience appear, but the proper condition of the application of the method is that it shall not, through prejudice of system, omit a single fact of consciousness. If the authority of consciousness is good in one instance, it is good in all. If not to be trusted in one, it is not to be trusted in any. Previous systems have erred in not presenting the facts of consciousness.
Observational method. The science of psychology results from observations about consciousness, and is the only proper basis of ontology or metaphysics, the science of being, and of the philosophy of history. To complement the observation of consciousness, Cousin adds induction, by which he means inference about reality that follows the data of consciousness, and regulated by reason. By his method of observation and induction, his philosophy is clearly distinguished from, on the one hand, the deductive construction of notions of an absolute system, as by Schelling or Hegel. Cousin regards this as nothing more than abstract hypothesis, not a legitimate way of obtaining data about reality. On the other hand, his view differs from Kant and Sir W. Hamilton, who are limited to knowledge of the phenomenal, with the acids of skepticism corrosively removing the great realities of ontology. The psychology of Cousin is expressed in a common sense, or a universal experience of humanity. Philosophy exists to explain universal convictions or beliefs, but common sense is, for him, the material upon which philosophy works, and its conclusions must be in harmony with said common sense.
3 results of psychological observation. The 3 great results of Cousin's psychological observation are sensibility, activity or liberty, and reason. These 3 facts are different in character, but are not separately found apart in consciousness. First, sensations, or the facts of the sensibility, are necessary. The facts of reason are also necessary, and reason is no less independent of the will than the sensibility. Second, voluntary facts alone have the characters of imputability and personality. The will alone is the person or me. The me is the center of the intellectual sphere without which consciousness is impossible. We find ourselves in a strange world, between two orders of phenomena which do not belong to us, which we apprehend only on the condition of our distinguishing ourselves from them. Further, we apprehend by means of a light which does not come from ourselves. All light comes from the reason, and it is the reason which apprehends both itself and the sensibility which envelops it, and the will which it obliges but does not constrain. Consciousness, then, is composed of these three integrant and inseparable elements, but reason is the immediate ground of knowledge and of consciousness itself.
But there is a peculiarity in Cousin's doctrine of activity or freedom, and in his doctrine of reason, which enters deeply into his system. This is the element of spontaneity in volition and in reason. This is the heart of what is Newell's in his doctrine of knowledge and being. Liberty or freedom is a generic term which means a cause or being endowed with self-activity. This is to itself and its own development its own ultimate cause. Free will is so, although it is preceded by deliberation and determination, that is reflection, for we are always conscious that even after determination we are free to will or not to will. But there is a primary kind of volition which has not reflection for its condition, which is yet free and spontaneous. We must have willed thus spontaneously first, otherwise we could not know, before our reflective volition, that we could will and act. Spontaneous volition is free as reflective, but it is the prior act of the two. This view of liberty of will is the only one in accordance with the facts of humanity. It excludes reflective volition, and explains the enthusiasm of the poet and the artist in the act of creation. It explains also the ordinary actions of mankind, which are done as a rule spontaneously and not after reflective deliberation.
Doctrine of the Reason, Part 1. Cousin's doctrine of reason is distinctive. Reason is given by observation is impersonal in its nature. It is not personally generated or at the whim of the subjective, but our conscious reason is an objective faculty that is a universal and necessary part of our being, recognizing that while the subjective conditions human knowledge in some sense, and to some degree, the primary and first emphasis for the reality of human knowledge is the objective reality our reason contemplates. Cousin thinks Kant missed this point with his analysis. But how does the integrity of this become established? Cousin thinks Kant went wrong by putting necessity as a subordinate part of reason, and limited what was necessary by the subjective perspective of the thinking mind. This restriction to the phenomenal made the conclusions of reason unable to reveal substantial reality or things in themselves, and made the absolute idea of logic and chain of reasoning subjective. But in making the objective nature of logical necessity subjective, the application of the laws of logic cannot reach past the subjective and into the objective. Further, what one person reasons with their own internal phenomenal logic might be different from what another person reasons. Person A sums two numbers in their mind 5 plus 7 and gets 13, while person B sums 5 plus 7 and gets 12, and just how could the truth of either proposition be distinguished?
Cousin's assertion is that reason is objective, not subjective, and that our reason can therefore be trusted to supply to our consciousness, in an act of spontaneous apperception or apprehension, immediately, instantaneously, in a sphere above the reflective consciousness, yet within the reach of knowledge. And all subjectivity with all reflection expires in the spontaneity of a mental process that adds something new to the body of ideas a person already has. The reason becomes subjective by relation to the voluntary and free self, but in itself it is impersonal. It belongs not to this or to that self in humanity. It belongs not even to humanity. We may say with truth that nature and humanity belong to it, for without its laws both would perish. But how can one enumerate such objective laws of logic? Kant, in reviewing the enterprise of Aristotle in modern times, gave a complete list of the laws of thought, but it is arbitrary in classification and may be legitimately reduced. According to Cousin, there are but two primary laws of thought, that of causality and that of substance. From these flow naturally all the others. In the order of nature, that of substance is the first and causality second. In the order of acquisition of our knowledge, causality precedes substance, or rather both are given us in each other, and both exist at the same time in consciousness.
Okay. What an interesting philosophy. So, Cousin's philosophy has three distinctive points associated with it. And those points are the method he uses, the results from that method, and then the way he applies that method and its results to history, especially to the history of philosophy. And so from his method derives psychology, or what we would today typically call epistemology. And then from the results of his method derive his ontology, or science of being. And then the application of the method, and especially in the results to history and the history of philosophy, is where his eclecticism comes from. And so Cousin insists here that the Scottish common sense philosophy and its foundational approach that built on top of dogmatic axioms or foundations was the right way to go. If one is to make the link between epistemology and ontology. So not only knowing how one knows something, but knowing that the thing one knows is actually a property of reality. And so he does this by noting the relationships between sensibility and activity of the will, and how they develop into the faculty of human reason. And so it's distinctive. Reason, as given by observation, is impersonal in its nature. So when the faculty of reason cogitates or turns the crank, it is not a subjective turn that is happening, but it is in fact a machinery that is objective and independent. And so that means that thoughts for the human race are not simply conditioned or at the whim of our subjective, but actually possess and bear an objective characteristic. And so one would expect, under this philosophy, that what one person reasons with their stimuli would correspond to the same thing. The same internal knowledge should generally be produced when a second person reasons in the same way. And so therefore reason is objective and not subjective. And reason can therefore be trusted to supply to our consciousness something that is subjectively conditioned, yet we can have a certainty of its objective status. So a very exciting second part here. There's more to come, and I'll hope that you join me on a future episode as we follow up more on the thought of Victor Cousin. We'll take a look at how his thought is relevant in bridging the gap between the often at war schools of philosophical thought of the Academy, the Continental Academy, and the Continental, the Common Sense School of Philosophy. So during the 19th century, those two schools were often at war, and Cousin found a way to bring them both together in his thought. And so we'll get a chance to see more of that in the future episode. For the Philosopher's Clearinghouse, this is Romans 918.